Hi everyone, I'm Huda, a games dev tutor at ACM. Today I'd like to talk about variables, what they are, how to use them, and why they matter. So here's a project that we used back in ACM After School Club to modify, and it's provided by Unity. Just look for the Defender example. So what we want to do is have a look at the inspector here and see the information that is provided by the inspector for each of these game objects. So a game object, as you may know, is any object here in the scene, and every time you click on one of them, you will see more information about it on the left side here in the inspector. So you see these fields here that you can change, and there are both numbers, and then you can have, for instance, sprites. You will have toggles here that you can check or uncheck. All of these that can be changed are variables, right? So variables are, I'll say, names that they're containers with a name that can hold information, just like we have in math with like x equals 5, for instance. So x is a variable, and the name is, well, x, and it can have different values. In that case, it's a number. But as we see here, it doesn't have to be a number. It can be different things. So in draw mode, you have simple. You can choose the type of mode, so it can hold different information. And this is good because then you can take that information and access it and use it in your program. You can change that information as well. So that's why it's very important to have a variable with a descriptive name. So let's have a look at the script and see how variables are used there. I'm going to be opening the script. So now I have opened the Detect and Fire script. It's of a class called Detect and Fire as well. We'll be talking about classes in another time. And you see here the first 4 lines. These are declarations and initiations of variables. And this is a method. We'll be talking about methods and what they are another time as well. But have a look at these 4 lines first. So they all start with either public or private. So that's the encapsulation. Encapsulation means that a variable, how accessible is a variable. So this variable can be accessed from anywhere, provided that we give that access to other classes. A private variable can only be accessed inside this class. And next we have the type of the variable. So as I said earlier, it can be any type. It can be a number, it can be a text, it can be, a box that you check and uncheck, and so on and so forth. So here we decide what type we want this variable to be. In this case, we have first a game object, which is a Unity type for an object in the game. And the second one, or the 3 other ones, are all floats, which means a number that has a decimal. And then we have the variable name. So as you see here, they have different names. And if you click on them, you'll see different places where it's highlighted. And this shows that it's being recognized in here and in here. And this is where we're using them. Cooldown time is being initiated, which means we have given it a value here, and it's being used here as well. So, and the other ones as well, like that, you can recognize it. So it's important, as I said earlier, to have a descriptive name, because you'll be using them and you need to keep track of the thought process you have to make it clearer, where we're using them and what information they're holding. So if you have a look at, for instance, cooldown time, which is private, it has 0.5 F. F here stands for float. So cooldown time is being used here. And you see that, in other words, is going to be the time since last fire plus 0.5 F. So that's basically what it means. These are being substituted with the actual numbers we've been giving them. Another thing to think about is the scope of variables. So every variable has been created within a scope, which means it has been created within a certain context, and it lives in that context, right? It can be accessed with scopes inside of scopes, but it cannot be accessed outside of the scope it was created. So if we look, for instance, at cooldown time, for instance, you see here, when you click on it, it will be marked here and here because it will recognize that since it's been created in the class scope, it can be accessed in the method scope, which is inside of the class scope. But if we are referring to it here, so cooldown time, for instance, equals, let's say, 5. If we refer to it here and we mark it, it's not going to recognize it. In fact, we get an error because it doesn't recognize it, and this is outside of the class scope. So you can recognize a scope by looking at these curly brackets here. They represent the beginning and the end of a scope. So this is the end of the class scope, and after that, this means nothing. So the scope is different from the encapsulation, as it's called, the public and private encapsulations, because the scope dictates the lifetime of a variable. So where it has meaning, where does it live? Whereas the public and private keywords here gets to decide who gets access, who gets to see this variable. So as an example, we have seen that these ones can be used inside of a method, right? But the method itself has its own scope, right? It starts from this curly bracket, and if you see I've marked it, then it will highlight the end of that scope. So anything that is created inside of a method is not going to have meaning outside of that method. It will basically die. It will be gone by the time we end this method. So it cannot be used outside of the method, inside of other methods, or inside of the class, which is a higher scope. So for instance, this game object called bullet here is created inside of this method. If we create it inside of the class, but outside of the method, so for instance, bullet, if we try to access it from here, then as you see, it will not recognize it. Let's see, 0 or something. Yeah, it will not access it. It will try to give me another suggestion. Let me see, bullet. I don't want any bullet attribute at all. We're getting an error. So it doesn't really understand what I'm referring to. And then there are other stuff to do with variables, like putting restrictions or exposing them to the world, really. So you can make them static, for instance, which means that they are going to be accessible and usable by any script. They don't even have to be inside of the game. That is, they don't have to be on an object that is, that you can interact with, or that is part of the scene that you're looking at. They can just be part of the scripts, somewhere in the backend or in the server, and still be accessible. So static is really good, but be very careful. They're not to be used anywhere and everywhere. It's and also it's to indicate that this game object can only be created once. You cannot create and recreate. So you can only have one bullet, let's say. So you don't want to use them all the time. So a variable can also be constant. So for instance, you want the cooldown time to always be 0.5 minutes, right? So you put const, this keyword, to indicate that once this variable has been initiated, so once it's gotten a value, like we have done here, 0.5, it will be 0.5 forever. You will not be able to change it. In fact, let me show you what that means. If I go here and say that cooldown time equals 2, right, and I save, I will get an error. Let's look at the error. It will say the left-hand side of an assignment must be a variable, property, or index. So it doesn't, it has also labeled it as a constant. So it's not a variable in the sense that it's changeable. And Therefore, I cannot change it. One last thing about variables is the naming convention. So C#, like many other languages, is case sensitive. So you have to make sure that if you want to use a variable, you have to match the exact spelling, including the capitalization. So I cannot use this with a small p here or with a big, I don't know, L or something. It has to match exactly as the way I have created it. Another thing to think about is that you cannot have spaces in a variable because the program will treat it as two different variables. And if you create it this way, it will give you an error because it says does not exist in the current context. It doesn't understand why this one is on its own out there. So you have to create a variable. If you want to string together several words, then there are conventions that we've been using called this is camel casing, for instance, where you start with a small letter, but then for every new word you capitalize the first letter. And it's very common in C# and Java and other languages. This is how we do it. And a bonus point on that for methods is exactly the same, except the first character is capitalized. So that's it for this time. And I hope you learned something new. Thank you for watching and see you next time.